The preceding chapter on the Chinese character has any general conclusion. It is that of the supremacy of the mind over material surroundings. Supremacy of the mind has more than one meaning. It means not only the application of human cunning to convert a world known to be full of pain and misery into a habitable place for human beings, but it implies also a certain contempt for mere physical courage and strength, as Confucius long ago condemned the Jack Dempsey type of physical courage in his disciple Ziluk. And I am sure he would have preferred a Jean Tunney who could be at home in circles of educated friends as well. Mencius, too, distinguished between mental labor and manual labor, and did not hesitate to put the former above the latter, for the Chinese had no nonsense about equality, and the respect for the mental laborers or the educated class has been an outstanding characteristic of the Chinese civilization. This respect for learning must be taken in a different sense from that usually understood in the West. For devoted as some Chinese scholars are to their learning, the devotion of some Western professors to their special subjects, sometimes amounting to a morbid pride and professional jealousy, seems to me much more impressive. The Chinese respect for the scholar is based on a different conception, for they respect that type of education which increases his practical wisdom, his knowledge of world affairs, and his judgment in times of crisis. It is a respect which, in theory at least, must be earned by actual worth. In local as in national troubles, the people look to him for cool judgment, for far-sightedness, for a better envisagement of the manifold consequences of an act or decision, and therefore for natural guidance and leadership. And real leadership is conceived as a leadership of the mind. With a majority of people illiterate, it is easy to maintain that leadership, sometimes by a mere jumble of unusual phrases that the illiterate only half understand, or by a reference to history of which the common people have only such knowledge as they can pick up from the theater. The reference to history generally settles the question, and it is characteristic because the Chinese mind thinks in terms of concrete analogy, which somehow puts the situation in a form that the common people can grasp in its entirety. I have already suggested that the Chinese suffer from an overdose of intelligence, as shown in their old roguery, their indifference, and in their pacifism, which so often borders on cowardice. But all intelligent men are cowards because intelligent men want to save their skins. There can be nothing more silly, if we keep our minds clear enough to see it, than a man popping his head over the top with a gin manufactured courage in order to meet a lead bullet and die for a newspaper manufactured cause. If he can use his head in reading newspapers, he will not be at the front, and if he can abstain from gin and keep a cool head, he should logically and humanly be in a blue funk. The last war has taught us that many gentle souls who shine at school or college undergo a mental torture at which the more robust and less intelligent have no inkling of an idea. And it is not the novice, but the man in service for 4 years who begins to realize that desertion is often a virtue one owes to himself and the only sane course open to a sensible and honest man. But the general mental intelligence of the Chinese race can be proved from other sources than cowardice. Chinese students in America and European colleges often distinguish themselves academically, and I think this is hardly due to a process of selection. The Chinese mind is long used to academic discussions at home. The Japanese have sarcastically dubbed the Chinese a literary nation, and justifiably so. An example of this is the enormous output of current Chinese magazines, which seem to crop up wherever a group of 4 or 5 friends get together in a city. and the tremendous number of writers who keep the magazine editors overwhelmed with their articles. The old imperial examinations, which, as I have pointed out, were a kind of intelligence test, long ago sharpened the Chinese scholar's mind in the fine use of words and in subtle literary distinctions, and the cultivation of poetry has trained them in the higher spheres of literary expression and in taste and finesse. The Chinese art of painting has reached a height yet unreached by the West, and in calligraphy they have forged a way alone and reached what I believe to be the maximum variety and refinement in the conception of rhythmic beauty. The Chinese mind therefore cannot be accused of lacking originality or creativeness. Its inventiveness has been equal to the handicraft stage in which Chinese industries have always remained, because of the failure to develop a scientific method, and because of the peculiar qualities of Chinese thinking. China has been backward in natural science. I have confidence, however, that with the importation of the scientific method and with adequate research facilities, China will be able to produce great scientists and make important contributions to the scientific world in the next century. Nor is such native intelligence confined to the educated class. Chinese servants are greatly welcomed on account of their general intelligence and human understanding, and must be put at least on par with European servants. Chinese merchants have prospered in the Malay states, in the East Indies, and in the Philippines chiefly because their intelligence has been greater than that of the natives, and because of those virtues that come from intelligence, such as thrift, steady industry, and farsightedness. The respect for scholarship has brought about a general desire for refinement even among the lower middle class, of which the foreigner is seldom aware. Foreign residents in Shanghai sometimes offend the department store salesmen by talking down to them in pidgin, not knowing that many of them are particular about a split infinitive. Chinese laborers are easily trained to be skilled mechanics where precision is required. One rarely sees in the slums and factory districts that type of big, husky animal of a similar class in the West, distinguished only by his big jaw, low forehead, and brute strength. One meets a different type, with intelligent eyes and cheerful appearance and an eminently reasonable temperament. Perhaps the variability of intelligence is decidedly lower among the Chinese than among many Western races. The same lower variability that we see in the mental powers of women as compared with variability in men. Indeed, the Chinese mind is akin to the feminine mind in many respects. Femininity, in fact, is the only word that can summarize its various aspects. The qualities of the feminine intelligence and feminine logic are exactly the qualities of the Chinese mind. The Chinese head, like the feminine head, is full of common sense. It is shy of abstract terms like women's speech. The Chinese way of thinking is synthetic, concrete, and revels in proverbs, like women's conversation. They never have had higher mathematics of their own, and seldom have gone beyond the level of arithmetic. Like many women, with the exception of those masculine women, prize winners at college, women have a surer instinct of life than men, and the Chinese have it more than other people. The Chinese depend largely upon their intuition for solving all nature's mysteries. That same intuition, or sixth sense, which makes many women believe a thing is so because it is so. And finally, Chinese logic is highly personal, like women's logic. A woman would not introduce a professor of ichthyology as a professor of ichthyology, but as the brother-in-law of Colonel Harrison, who died in India while she was undergoing an operation for appendicitis in New York, by that lovable old Dr. Kappa. You should look at his handsome forehead. In the same way, a Chinese judge cannot think of law as an abstract entity but as a flexible quantity as it should be personally applied to Colonel Huang or Major Li. Accordingly, any law which is not personal enough to respond to the personality of Colonel Huang or Major Li is inhuman and therefore no law at all. Chinese justice is an art, not a science. Jesperson, in his well-known book, The Growth and Structure of English, once referred to the masculine qualities of the English language by pointing to its love of economy, common sense, and forcefulness. Without wanting to contradict so great an authority on the English language, I beg to differ on a point which concerns the sexes. Common sense and the common sense and the practical mind are characteristics of women rather than of men, who are more liable to take their feet off the ground and soar to impossible heights. The Chinese language and grammar show this femininity exactly because the language, in its form, syntax, and vocabulary, reveals an extreme simplicity of thinking, concreteness of imagery, and economy of syntactical relationships. This simplicity is best illustrated from pigeon, which is English meat with Chinese bones, as we say in China. There is no reason why ascendants like he come, come, you come, he no come should not be considered as clear as the more roundabout you needn't come if he comes and he needn't come if you come. In fact, this simplicity makes for clarity of expression. Moon in Dean's English quotes an English Somerset farmer as testifying before the judge. He'd a stick, and he'd a stick, and he licked he, and he licked he. If he licked he as hard as he licked he killed he, and not he. And this seems to me a much more sensible way of talking than one with the dramatic case distinctions. For according to the Chinese, the difference between I lick he and he lick I is perfectly clear without the subjective accusative complex, and the adding of the third person singular s is as superfluous as is already proved to be in the past tense. I had, he had, I went, he went. Actually, lots of people are saying us girls and them things without ever being misunderstood or losing anything except a meaningless class, which has nothing to do with the beauty of expression. I have great hope that English and American professors will one day bravely and respectably pronounce he don't in the classrooms, and that the English language may one day become as sensible and clear as the Chinese, through the influence of pidgin. A certain feminine practical instinct has already guided the English to abbreviate all their subordinate clauses as much as possible, like weather permitting, God willing, if possible, whenever necessary, as expected. If I don't, not, shall not, come back tonight. And if war breaks out, not, shall break out next week. Jesperson already mentioned such examples of Chinese simplicity in English as first come, first served, no cure, no pay, once bitten, twice shy, which are all standard pidgin. They are beginning to drop the whom, too. Who are you speaking to? English grammar is therefore not far from salvation. The Chinese love of simplicity, however, far ahead, as in the expression sit, eat, mountain, empty, which to the Chinese clearly means that if you only sit and eat and do nothing, even a fortune as big as a mountain will vanish. Therefore, it will be some time before the English can catch up with us. The Chinese concrete way of thinking can also be illustrated by the nature of its abstract terms and prevalence of proverbs and metaphoric expressions. An abstract notion is often expressed by the combination of two concrete qualities, as big small for size, long short for length, broad narrow for breadth. What is the big small of your shoes? Long and short. Long and short also refer to the right and wrong of parties in a dispute, as the Chinese expression is one's argument is long or short, and therefore we have expressions like I don't care for its long short, similar to the English the long and the short of it. The long and the short of it is that man has no right wrong, meaning he is a good man because he preserves a godlike indifference toward all questions and does not get involved in private disputes. Abstract endings like "ness" are also unknown in Chinese, and the Chinese simply say with Mencius that the white of a white horse is not the same as the white of a white jade. This has a bearing on their lack of analytical thinking. Women, so far as I know, avoid using abstract terms. This, I think, has been proved by an analytical study of the vocabulary of women authors. The analytical statistical method is in itself a habit of the Western mind, for the Chinese has far too much common sense to go to the trouble of counting words to prove it. When he feels the truth directly that women's vocabulary in speech and writing is decidedly less abstract, that is sufficient for him. With the Chinese, as with women, concrete imagery always takes the place of abstract terminology. The highly academic sentence, there is no difference but difference of degrees between different degrees of difference and no difference, cannot be exactly reproduced in Chinese, and a Chinese translator would probably substitute for it the Mencian question: what is the difference between running away 50 steps and running away 100 steps in battle? Loses in definition and exactness, but gains in intelligibility. To say, how could I perceive his inner mental process, is not so intelligible as, how could I know what is going on in his mind? And this, in turn, is decidedly less effective than the Chinese. Am I a tapeworm in his belly? Chinese thought, therefore, always remains on the periphery of the visible world, and this helps a sense of fact, which is the foundation of experience and wisdom. This dislike of abstract terms is further seen in the Chinese names for classifications, which usually require sharply defined terms. Instead, the Chinese always seek for the most expressive names for different categories. Thus, in Chinese literary criticism, there are different methods of writing called the method of watching a fire across the river, detachment of style, the method of dragonflies skimming the water surface, lightness of touch, the method of painting a dragon and dotting its eyes, bringing out the salient points, the method of releasing a captive before capturing him, playing about a subject, the method of showing the dragon's head without showing his tail, freedom of movement and waywardness of thought, the method of sharp precipice overhanging a 10,000 feet ravine, abruptness of ending, the method of letting blood by one needle prick, direct epigrammatic guide, the method of going straight into the fray with one knife, direct opening, the method of announcing a campaign on the east and marching to the west, surprise attack, the method of side stabs and flanking attacks, light raillery, the method of a light mist hanging over a gray lake, mellow and toned down style, the method of layers of clouds and hilltops, accumulation, the method of throwing lighted firecrackers at a horse's buttocks, final stab toward conclusion, etc., etc. Such names suggest picturesque terms like the bow wow, poo poo, and sing song theories of the origin of speech. This profuseness of imagery and paucity of abstract terminology has an influence on the style of writing and consequently on the style of thought. On the one hand, it makes for vividness. On the other, it may easily degenerate into a senseless decorativeness without exact content, which has been the besetting sin of many periods of Chinese literature, and against which Han Yu and the Tang Dynasty set up a revolt. Such a style suffers from lack of exactness of expression, but at its best it brings about, as in the best non-classical novels, a sauntering prose, racy, idiomatic, and smelling of the soil like the prose of Swift and Defoe in the best English tradition, as we say. It also avoids the pitfalls of a type of academic jargon which is rapidly growing in American university circles, especially among the psychologists and the sociologists. We talk of human life only in terms of factors, processes, individualization, departmentalization, quotas of ambition, standardization of anger, and coefficients of happiness. Such a style is practically untranslatable into Chinese, although some ludicrous efforts have been made in it under the slogan of Europeanization of Chinese, which is rapidly dying out of vogue. Translation from English into Chinese is hardest in scientific treatises, while translation from Chinese into English is hardest in poetry and decorative prose, where every word contains an image. Sufficient decision of the characteristics of Chinese thinking has been made to enable us to appreciate the cause of their failure to develop natural science. The Greeks laid the foundation of natural science because the Greek mind was essentially an analytical mind, a fact which is proved by the striking modernity of Aristotle. The Egyptians developed geometry and astronomy, sciences which required an analytical mind, and the Hindus developed a grammar of their own. The Chinese, with all their native intelligence, never developed the science of grammar, and their mathematics and astronomical knowledge have largely been imported, for the Chinese mind delights only in moral platitudes, and their abstract terms like benevolence, kindliness, propriety, and loyalty are so general that in such discussions they are naturally lost in vague generalities. Of all the ancient philosophers of the Zhou dynasty, only Mozi and Han Feizi developed a style akin to cogent reasoning. Mencius, who was undoubtedly a great sophist, cared only for such big words as utility and righteousness. All the rest of them, like Zhuangzi, Liezi, and Huainanzi, delighted in graceful metaphors. The disciples of Mozi, Huishi, Kongsun who were great sophists, were interested in spinning scholastic conundrums and in endeavoring to prove such propositions as eggs have hair on them, horses lay eggs, a dog may be a lamb, a chicken has 3 legs, fire is not warm, the wheel never touches the ground, a tortoise is longer than a snake, etc. The scholars of the Han Dynasty, which soon followed, were interested only in making Alexandrian commentaries on the classics of the preceding period. The Chen scholars after them revived Taoism and depended on their intuition for the solving of the mysteries of their own bodies and the universe. Experimentation was never thought of, and no scientific method had been developed. The Song philosophers reinterpreted Confucianism in the light of Buddhism and transformed it into a system of mental discipline and moral hygiene. They developed a reputation for grasping the general content of a book without wanting to know it thoroughly. The Song scholars had therefore the most unscientific philology, or no philology at all. Only as late as the Qing Manchu dynasty has there developed a comparative method, which at once put the Qing philology on a height unattained before. Qing philology was the nearest approach to a scientific method in China. It is easy to see why the Chinese mind cannot develop a scientific method, for the scientific method, besides being analytical, always involves an amount of stupid drudgery, while the Chinese believe in flashes of common sense and insight, and inductive reasoning carried over to human relationships, in which the Chinese are primarily interested, often result in a form of stupidity not so rare in American universities. There are today doctorate dissertations in the inductive method which would make Bacon turn in his grave. No Chinese could possibly be stupid enough to write a dissertation on ice cream, and after a series of careful observations announced the staggering conclusion that the primary function of sugar in the manufacture of ice cream is to sweeten it, or after a methodological study in time and motion comparison on 4 methods of dishwashing, happily perceived that stooping and lifting are fatiguing, or that in a study of the bacterial content of cotton undershirts, the number of bacteria tends to increase with the length of time garments are worn. A newspaper report several years ago stated that a University of Chicago student, after making a comparative study of the impressional power of various types of lettering, found that the blacker the lines, the more striking they are to the eye. This sort of stupidity, although useful to business advertisement, could really be arrived at, I think, just as correctly by a moment of Chinese common sense and intuition. The best cartoon I have ever seen in Punch is that of a congress of behaviorists who, after passing a number of pig subjects through a test with a thermometer in the snout and a pearl necklace dangling in front, unanimously respond, pigs do not respond to the sight of jewelry. These things cannot be merely prostitution of the scientific method, for we find that Professor Coslin of Rochester University read a paper at the 9th Annual International Conference of Psychologists on the origin and nature of common annoyances, in which he had noted 21,000 kinds of annoyances, which, after deducing duplications and spurious annoyances, were later reduced to 507, and in which he succeeded in grading these annoyances, like 26 marks for hair and food, 2 for the sight of a bald head, and 24 for cockroaches. A certain amount of stupid drudgery is, of course, part and parcel of true scientific work. Only true scientific discipline can enable a scientist to take delight in the discovery that an earthworm has a certain protective covering, for it is on the accumulation of such minutely observed facts that science grew from generation to generation to its present magnificent attainments. Without that scientific outlook, and with a large share of humor and common sense, the Chinese must necessarily consider the study and observation of the life of an earthworm or of a goldfish as beneath the dignity of a scholar.